The silence in Miss Park So-yeon's apartment, nestled within a new, gleaming residential complex on the outskirts of Seoul, was a companion she had grown accustomed to, though not entirely fond of. At 62, recently retired from a life spent cataloguing stories as a librarian, she now found herself adrift in an unwritten chapter of her own. The silver locket at her throat, a tender gift from her late husband, was cool against her skin, a constant reminder of warmth that now felt distant. Her days, once structured by the Dewey Decimal System and the quiet rustle of turning pages, stretched before her, vast and unnervingly empty. From her window she often watched other retirees, some briskly walking in tracksuits, others gathered on park benches, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. A few, like her, seemed to drift alone. A familiar ache, a blend of loneliness and a yearning for purpose, settled in her chest. Years ago, a book club she'd cherished had dissolved amidst petty squabbles and unspoken resentments. The memory was a faint scar, a reminder of how easily good intentions could sour. Yet the librarian in her, the archivist of human connection, couldn't resist the urge to try again. What if, she mused, one could curate a gathering like a perfect collection, each member a well-chosen volume, contributing to a harmonious whole? The idea for the Golden Years Hobby Club sparked a small flame against the encroaching shadows of solitude, a haven of shared interests, gentle companionship, and mutual support. She broached the idea tentatively with a few neighbours during a chance encounter at the local market. Mrs. Go, with her perpetually kind eyes, thought it a lovely notion. Mr. Bay, a retired engineer, grunted a non-committal approval. The encouragement was mild, but enough. One crisp spring afternoon, Seo-yeon invited a small group to her apartment for tea and carefully arranged yakgwa. The scent of ginger and honey filled the air, a hopeful fragrance. "I was thinking," she began, her hands unconsciously smoothing the lapels of her soft cardigan, "that perhaps some of us might enjoy, well, a club, for hobbies or just to talk. A Golden Years Hobby Club, perhaps." A woman with a bright, energetic smile and a voice that filled the room immediately seconded the motion. This was Mrs. Choi Min-jun, a relatively new resident known for her dynamism and, as So-yeon would soon learn, her unshakable opinions. "A splendid idea, So-yeon, see? Absolutely splendid. We retirees need to stay active, engaged. I'd be more than happy to help you organise. We can make it truly special." Mrs. Choi's offer, though generous, carried an undertone of taking charge, a subtle positioning. In a quieter corner, Kang Ji-hoon, a retired philosophy teacher with thoughtful eyes, nodded slowly, a flicker of interest in his otherwise reserved demeanour. He murmured, "Community is important at any age." Ms. Lee Hana, a woman whose polite smile never quite reached her eyes, offered a saccharine, "Oh, that sounds nice." The first official meeting was set for the following week in the community centre's multi-purpose room. As her guests departed, leaving behind the scent of tea and the echo of Mrs. Choi's booming enthusiasm, So-yeon touched her locket. A surge of optimism, fragile yet persistent, warmed her. This time, she thought, it would be different. The first few meetings of the Golden Years Hobby Club unfolded with a gentle, promising rhythm. So-yeon arrived early at the community centre's multi-purpose room each week, wiping down the tables, arranging chairs in a welcoming circle, and often bringing a thermos of barley tea or homemade majakwa. Membership grew steadily. There was Mrs. Song, who taught a few members the basics of traditional Korean knot-tying, her gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. Mr. Park, a former history teacher, led a lively discussion on the Joseon dynasty. They even had a small, tentative poetry reading, where So-yeon herself shared a piece by Yoon Dong-ju, her voice soft but clear. Mrs. Choi Min-jun was a whirlwind of activity. She secured a discount for the group at a local art supply store, organised a sign-up sheet for a potential day trip to Suwon, and enthusiastically volunteered to manage a small kitty for tea and snacks. "We must be organised, So-yeon-si," she'd declare, her voice resonating with cheerful authority. So-yeon, grateful for the help and initially mistaking Mrs. Choi's assertiveness for pure zeal, tried to accommodate her suggestions, even when they felt a little too ambitious for their fledgling group. The club was meant to be a gentle current, not a rushing river. Miss Lee Hana, however, moved through the group like a subtle mist. She was always ready with a compliment for So-yeon's efforts, but it was often followed by a whispered aside to another member. So-yeon-si is so dedicated, isn't she? Though perhaps a bit traditional in her approach. Well, that barley tea is nice, but wouldn't a proper coffee machine be better for the community room? Just a thought. These were small seeds of discontent, planted with such practiced casualness that they were almost unnoticeable, yet they began to take root. The first noticeable crack appeared during a discussion about a future outing. Mrs. Choi, brimming with excitement, proposed a trip to a renowned botanical garden that was a good 2-hour bus ride away and carried a significant entrance fee. It will be a wonderful experience. Fresh air, beautiful flowers. We can hire a bus. A polite but palpable silence followed. So-yeon saw Mrs. Go's brow furrow slightly. Mr. Bae coughed. It was Mr. Kim Byung-ho, a jovial retired businessman who always dressed impeccably and occasionally hinted at successful ventures, who broke the silence. That sounds lovely, Mrs. Choi. Perhaps a bit on the pricey side for some, but a fine idea. He then added, with a magnanimous wave of his hand, I wouldn't mind contributing a little extra to make it more affordable for everyone. The offer, though seemingly generous, hung awkwardly in the air. Ms. Lee Hana seized the moment. Oh, Mr. Kim, you're always so generous, she cooed, then turned to Mrs. Song. But still, it's quite an expense, isn't it? Some of us are on fixed pensions. The implication was clear. Mr. Kim could afford it. Others couldn't. The discussion devolved into a polite but strained debate about costs, with Mrs. Choi staunchly defending her idea, subtly backed by Mr. Kim's willingness to subsidize. Seo-yeon tried to steer the conversation towards more accessible local options, like a visit to the nearby Bukhansan National Park, but the atmosphere had already shifted. Envy, that quiet corrosive, had made its first appearance, masked as practical concern. Soon, Mrs. Choi began to take more unilateral decisions. A new notice about a flower arrangement workshop, convener Choi Min-jun, appeared on the community board without prior group discussion. When So-yeon gently inquired, Mrs. Choi beamed. Oh, I just thought it would be a lovely surprise, So-yeon-si, to save you the trouble of organizing everything. You do so much already. Her smile was wide, but So-yeon felt a prickle of unease. The we was subtly becoming an I in Mrs. Choi's pronouncements. Small cliques started to form. Mrs. Choi had her admirers, those who enjoyed her boisterous energy and ambitious plans. They would often gather around her after the official meeting ended, their laughter a little louder, their discussions a little more exclusive. Others, who preferred So-yeon's quieter, more inclusive approach, found themselves on the periphery. The easy camaraderie of the initial weeks was fraying. One afternoon, after a particularly strained meeting where Mrs. Choi had steamrolled a decision about purchasing new board games, ones So-yeon felt were too complex for most members, So-yeon found herself walking with Mr. Kang Ji-hoon towards the complex's small, landscaped garden. The azaleas were in full bloom, a riot of pink and purple, but their beauty felt distant to her. It's becoming more complicated than I envisioned, So-yeon confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. She touched her locket, a nervous habit. Mr. Kang looked at the meticulously pruned bonsai trees lining the path. Human beings are complex creatures, Miss Park, he said, his tone gentle. When they gather, their complexities multiply. It is like nunchi. We are all trying to read the room, but sometimes the room itself is full of conflicting signals. He paused, then added, A desire for harmony is noble, but harmony often requires more than just good intentions. Sometimes it requires a conductor who is willing to silence a discordant note, even if it's played with great enthusiasm. So-yeon understood his veiled reference to Mrs. Choi, but the thought of direct confrontation, of creating open discord, made her stomach churn. She was a librarian, a preserver of order, not a warrior. I just wanted a place for gentle fellowship, she sighed. Mr. Kang offered a small, melancholic smile. A worthy goal, Miss Park, but gentleness can be mistaken for weakness in a world that often values noise. His words, though kind, settled like a stone in So-yeon's heart, a premonition of further troubles. The cracks widened. A disagreement over whether to use the small club funds, a modest sum collected from voluntary contributions for tea and supplies, to buy a new expensive coffee machine for the community room, a pet project of Mrs. Choi's, became a source of protracted, albeit politely veiled, conflict. Mrs. Choi argued it would elevate the club's status and attract more members. So-yeon, backed by a quieter faction including Mrs. Go, felt it was an unnecessary expense, and that the funds should be used for shared craft materials or subsidizing simpler outings. The debate simmered for weeks, conducted through carefully worded suggestions and pointed silences during meetings. Ms. Lee Hana fanned the flames with whispers of, "Mrs. Choi just wants to show off," to one group, and So-yeon-si is a bit resistant to progress, isn't she? To another. The strain began to show on So-yeon. The neat bun she usually wore seemed a little looser, the lines around her eyes deeper. She found herself meticulously planning each meeting, not with joy, but with a sense of trepidation, anticipating potential points of friction. One afternoon, while fetching more tea from the community kitchen, she overheard Ms. Lee Hana's voice, sharp and clear, from just around the corner. "And So-yeon-si, bless her heart, she means well, but she's just too soft to manage a group this size. We need someone with a bit more drive, like Mrs. Choi." The words struck So-yeon like a physical blow. She retreated, her face burning, the teapot rattling in her trembling hand. She sought refuge in the sterile quiet of the restroom, staring at her reflection. The optimistic woman who had envisioned a haven of gentle companionship seemed to be fading, replaced by a tired, anxious stranger. The locket felt heavy against her chest. Her late husband had always admired her quiet strength, her ability to create calm. Where was that strength now? She dreaded the weekly gatherings she had once initiated with such hope. The joy had leached out, replaced by a constant, draining vigilance. She tried to mediate, to smooth over the increasingly frequent ripples of discord, but her efforts often felt like trying to mend a torn tapestry with a single thread. The club's atmosphere, despite the forced politeness that was a hallmark of many Korean social interactions, was palpably tense. Laughter felt strained, conversations carefully navigated. Even the simple act of sharing snacks became fraught, with subtle judgments passed on who brought what, or who ate how much. Mr. Kim Bung-ho, the retired businessman, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. If he offered to treat the group to coffee after a meeting, Ms. Lee would murmur about him showing off his wealth. If he demurred, he'd overhear whispers about him being surprisingly stingy for a rich man. He began to attend less frequently, his jovial demeanor replaced by a wary caution. So-yeon confided more in Mr. Kang. Their quiet conversations after the tumultuous meetings became her only solace. "I feel like I'm failing," she admitted one evening, watching the sunset paint the Seoul sky in hues of orange and purple from the community center window. Mr. Kang adjusted his spectacles. "Failure, Miss Park, is often a matter of perspective. Perhaps you are not failing the group, but the group is failing to live up to your initial, noble vision. Ideals are fragile things when confronted with the friction of everyday human nature." He paused. "Sometimes the best one can do is to protect one's own peace." His words were wise, but offered little practical comfort for the knot of anxiety that had taken permanent residence in So-yeon's stomach. She still felt a heavy sense of responsibility, a librarian's instinct to preserve what was good, even if it was crumbling before her eyes. The year drew to a close, and with it came the unspoken expectation of a year-end gathering. So-yeon, despite her growing wariness, decided to make one last concerted effort to recapture the club's initial spirit. She meticulously planned a modest party, a potluck, some simple games, and a small, heartfelt ceremony where she intended to give out handwritten certificates of appreciation for various members' contributions, no matter how small. This was her attempt to re-emphasize inclusivity and mutual respect, the cornerstones of her original dream. She even baked her signature honey cakes, their sweet scent a fragile offering of hope. The evening of the party arrived, cold and crisp. The community room was decorated with paper lanterns So-yeon had painstakingly made. Members arrived, bundled in coats, their greetings polite, but carrying an undercurrent of the group's now familiar tension. So-yeon, forcing a smile, moved among them, her locket a small anchor. Just as she was about to begin her welcoming remarks and start the awards, Mrs. Choi Min-jun clapped her hands loudly, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Everyone, I have a wonderful surprise. To liven things up, I've arranged for a karaoke machine to be delivered. It should be here any minute." A ripple of mixed reactions went through the room. Mrs. Choi's faction cheered enthusiastically. Others, including So-yeon, looked taken aback. Karaoke had never been part of their club's ethos. So-yeon's carefully planned schedule, her quiet awards, felt instantly trivialized, swept aside by Mrs. Choi's grand, unannounced gesture. Before So-yeon could recover, Ms. Lee Hana's voice, laced with feigned disappointment, piped up from near the food table. "Oh dear, the japchae is a bit cold, isn't it? And the fruit platter seems smaller than what we had at Mrs. Kim's son's engagement party last month." The comparison was unnecessary, designed only to subtly denigrate the collective effort of the potluck. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. The karaoke machine arrived, and soon the room was filled with a cacophony of enthusiastic, if not always tuneful singing, led by Mrs. Choi. So-yeon's appreciation certificates lay forgotten on a side table. Then a small financial misunderstanding regarding contributions for the extra snacks Mrs. Choi had ordered without consultation led to a brief, tense, and very public, though still couched in polite language, disagreement between Mrs. Choi and a flustered Mr. Bae, with Mr. Kim Byung-ho attempting to mediate, only to be subtly accused by Ms. Lee of always siding with those who have money. So-yeon stood by the window, watching the vibrant, chaotic scene that was so far removed from her vision of a gentle year-end celebration. The paper lanterns she had so carefully hung seemed to mock her. A wave of profound exhaustion, a grief almost, washed over her. Her dream of a harmonious club, a sanctuary of kindness, was not just fractured, it was shattered. She didn't break down, didn't raise her voice. Her training as a librarian, her ingrained habit of maintaining composure held, but something inside her quietly gave way. The light in her eyes dimmed. The party, or rather Mrs. Choi's version of it, limped on, but for So-yeon, it was already over. In the days following the disastrous year-end party, a strange quiet descended upon So-yeon. The acute anxiety that had plagued her for months began to recede, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment, but also, surprisingly, a sliver of relief. The burden of trying to steer a ship that was determined to go its own way, a way so different from her intended course, had been lifted. She sat in her quiet apartment, the uneaten honey cakes from the party still on the counter, a testament to her failed hopes. She looked at her late husband's photograph. "You always knew how to navigate these things, she whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. "I, it seems, am still learning." She made a conscious decision, not through a dramatic announcement, but through a gradual, quiet withdrawal. She no longer arrived early to set up the community room. She stopped bringing homemade snacks. When Mrs. Choi, with a perfunctory, "Are you sure, So-yeon-si? We'll miss your touch," effectively took over the planning and direction of the Golden Years Hobby Club, So-yeon offered no resistance. The club continued, perhaps even more boisterously than before, with more outings, more workshops organized by Mrs. Choi, and a clear divide between Mrs. Choi's enthusiastic followers and the quieter, more peripheral members. So-yeon attended sporadically, more an observer now than a participant, her presence a ghost of its former self. The laughter seemed louder, the activities more numerous, but the warmth, the genuine connection she had strived for, felt absent. Yet, from the ashes of her larger ambition, something smaller and more genuine began to emerge. Mr. Kang Ji-hoon, who had also become less regular in his attendance at the main club gatherings, sought her out. "The pursuit of grand harmony can be exhausting, Miss Park," he said one afternoon as they shared a cup of tea at a small, unassuming cafe near the complex, a place far removed from the community centre's charged atmosphere. Perhaps true fellowship is found in quieter corners. They started meeting regularly, sometimes joined by